Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrew Chi, a research fellow here at the IISS and the editor of the Armed Conflict Database. Let me welcome you this afternoon for discussion with Eddie Thomas. Eddie is an associate fellow at the History Department at SOAS and a fellow at the Rift Valley Institute. He's lived and worked in South Sudan and Sudan for over the last 8 years as a teacher, researcher, and a human rights worker for both the Sudanese and international organizations as well. Eddie is the author of Islam's Perfect Stranger and South Sudan, A Slow Liberation. I have a signed copy of that as well, so appreciate that. And a really good book. And he's also appeared on BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, to just name a few. The topic of Eddie's discussion today is South Sudan, the state and the economics of everyday life. This event will be on the record, so without further waiting, I'll hand it over to Eddie.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for inviting me, Andrew, and thanks for coming along today. It's really great to have an opportunity to speak with a select and small group. Andrew asked me to give a sort of brief overview of the situation in South Sudan and then talk a little bit about something that I've been working on, which is the economics of everyday life, how people are getting by, and how much the process of getting by tells us about big topics like violence and crisis and politics in South Sudan. But I'm going to start just by giving you a brief overview, and my apologies, I'm sure a lot of you know an awful lot more about the country about the politics of the country than I do. I just came back from there yesterday, and I was working in WOW, so I know practically nothing about what's going on because I didn't have any internet. After several decades of civil war, South Sudan signed a 2005 peace deal with the Khartoum government, which led in 2011 to secession and independence. And in 2013, a split in the ruling Sudan People's Liberation Movement, which had led the struggle for independence, spread to the Sudan People's Liberation Army, and a civil war began, which has not yet ended. The army dominates the political movement. It fought for more than 2 decades against the Khartoum government in a war of multiple and shifting objectives. Initially, socialist transformation of the whole of Sudan, later independence of South Sudan, also control over oil resources and revenues, and a number of other, very deeply held kind of principles. The Sudanese army's counterinsurgency strategy was one of ethnic fragmentation and militarization. That's to say, it didn't often engage the rebels directly, but it created dozens of South Sudanese militias configured around ethnicity. In the years after the 2005 peace deal, the army was used as a means of reversing this fragmentation. Its units and commanders were drawn from the old Liberation Army and all of its former adversaries. It was an ambitious attempt at national reconciliation through military means, and it failed more terrifyingly than anyone can really have anticipated. A report from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine last year estimated that South Sudan, with a population around 10, 12 million, depending on the method that you use to estimate and the number of refugees that you count, had suffered about 380,000 excess deaths as a result of the conflict in 4 years to 2017, and an additional 190,000 deaths as a direct result of violence. As a comparison, Iraq, with a population of about 27 million in the early 21st century, suffered between 400,000 and 1 million excess deaths, according to epidemiological evidence, in the 3 years after the invasion and during the occupation, and it suffered about 600,000 deaths due to violence. So it's a very serious dent in the whole population of a relatively small country. In 2014, the army, the war that began in 2013 and continued through 2014, the army was split into 2 factions, which mobilized militias by militarizing or criminalizing young youth elements from local ethnic constituencies. That's to say, they mobilized they created the same kind of war which the Khartoum government had previously created in South Sudan. The government and opposition fought for controls of towns and territories in Upper Nile, the northeastern third of the country, and other groups in Upper Nile were drawn into the conflict. In 2015, regional mediators concluded a peace deal, and in 2016, opposition leader Riek Machar returned to Juba for a brief spell in a consensus government. That ended in a shootout at the presidential palace, and he fled into exile and is now under virtual house arrest in Khartoum. After 2016, the government used international support to isolate Machar and control the Upper Nile towns. The centre of the violence moved south towards Equatoria, where new armed groups formed. Until 2018, peace negotiations had been largely handled by Ethiopia on behalf of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the regional body for the crisis-prone Horn of Africa, a somewhat fractious regional body with little consensus, which seldom finds it difficult to operate by consensus. In 2018, however, the mediation was passed to Sudan and Uganda, probably for internal Ethiopian political reasons. And Sudan and Uganda are South Sudan's most economically important and interfering neighbours. And they've previously fought each other in proxy wars in South Sudan. The interfering neighbours and their security services succeeded in pushing through a revitalised peace deal, and Machar was due to return to Juba and to government on the 12th of May this year. A few days before that, however, the deadline was non-renewably extended by 6 months in order to implement security arrangements and reach an agreement on the key issue of administrative boundaries. I want to talk a little bit about this because it's a really big issue. Oh, let's see. I'm going to start. I've got a few slides. I don't want to tire you with slides, but I've got some kind of stats and maps that I thought were probably easier to understand. In 2015 and 2016, presidential decrees divided up the 10 constitutionally recognized states into 28 and then into 32 new states. And this is a map of the 28 states, which is circulated a bit on the internet, and it's circulated because it's quite an ethnic-sounding map, or ethnic-looking map. The government's adversaries believe that the new states are aimed at gerrymandering majorities for the government's key ethnic constituency, the Dinka social group or ethnic group. So you can see the red areas there are all supposedly Dinka majority areas, and they're also a number of the oil areas, Ruweng in the center right at the top and Eastern Nile to the east right at the top are both areas where a lot of South Sudan's oil resources are held. So there was this feeling that the government was using state division partly to create its own kind of ethnic majorities. And this policy of proliferating local state administrations and arguments over borders is deeply implicated in the current violence. The 2018 peace deal has greatly reduced hostilities between the government and opposition forces, but hundreds of local conflicts have taken their place. In the 3 months since the end of May this year, to the end of May this year, the UN recorded 152 incidents of local conflicts, leading to 531 deaths, which I imagine is a serious underestimate. So this administrative boundary making was implicated in the violence. It set people against each other on these borders, which were not very relevant until quite recently. But the violence is also partly linked to the economic crisis in the country. The government depends overwhelmingly on oil revenues for its finances. Until 2015, the government was able to manage international trade and currency well enough to finance its budget, which mostly goes on its security forces. But a spell of hyperinflation and currency depreciation after 2015 have been transforming markets, even if the inflationary pressures have diminished somewhat since the 2018 peace deal. about 4.3 million people have been displaced, about half of the population perhaps, or almost half of the population, and about 2 million of those are refugees in neighbouring countries. And this has severely impacted agricultural production, pushing almost 6 million people into severe hunger. These hungry people mostly depend on markets to buy basic foods. And that's one of the big things that I'm working on at the moment, is this transition to markets, because depending on markets is a relatively new thing. But depending on markets for food is a relatively new thing in South Sudan. In the 19th century, there was almost no social recognition of money in South Sudan. Nobody in their right mind would do anything for money. That attitude, in some ways, was the undoing of the South Sudanese at the time, when colonialists and entrepreneurs tried to buy goods like ivory and services like portering services. They were rebuffed, and they quickly turned to violence, looting food, abducting and enslaving people, and robbing the forest of its bounty. That violence lasted up until the 1930s, really, when British colonialists found a formula of repression that was stable enough to permit taxation by money and mobilize labour with a mixture of wages and coercion rather than by coercion alone. But they still, even at that point, couldn't persuade people to buy and sell food. South Sudan's subsistence system supplied local needs. Almost no food was imported at the time, and these subsistence systems generated enough surplus to feed several thousand colonial administrators and soldiers and other non-productive elements in society. The rest of the surplus circulated through social networks rather than through markets. And I'd like to ask you to consider what that means, and I'm going to give you an example of it. This social circulation operated in many ways, the most famous of which is the bridewell systems of South Sudan's cattle-keeping groups. These groups organize the intergenerational transfer of wealth, not through death and inheritance like our society, but at marriage, when the patriarchs and matriarchs are all still alive. To get married, young cattle-keeping men have to persuade their mums and dads, their favourite aunties, and their hard-luck uncles to give them 2 or 3 dozen cattle, and they distribute those cattle amongst the parents and wider family of their bride. The surplus, then, is used to deepen social and productive alliances between a wide group of people, rather than being turned into money, which is then used to price and pay for production. So that's the old system, and it's still, the vestiges of it, or it's still a part of life today. But this system is now being dramatically reshaped by markets and violence. I've been working with a group of South Sudanese colleagues on a project which tries to understand this shift. It's an attempt to look beyond oil revenues and the armed forces and patronage systems which they finance. The oil arms patronage nexus illustrates an important feature of South Sudan's economic system, and that is that the state is economically independent of the productive efforts of the population. Unlike many other states, it doesn't really make an alliance with economic constituencies, with financiers or farmers or factory workers, and use those alliances with economic interests to intervene in society, to reach its goals. And that's the fact that South Sudan's state has almost no shared economic interests in common with its people is one of the reasons why it's so reliant on ethnic constituencies, and it expends so much effort on apparently pointless reorganizations of local administrative boundaries, because that's how politics happens when you don't have any kind of economic raison d'etre as a state vis-a-vis your own population. But the productive systems are still there, and they're being totally reshaped by violence, and patterns of accumulation and consumption are also being reshaped by violence, and everything is being commodified at the moment. Understanding this shift, I think, can help people understand South Sudan's conflicted politics. I want to take you through a few figures now, and first of all, I want to show you a set of figures which come from FAO, which show the sources of cereals and roots consumed by households just before the harvest a couple of years ago. You can see South Sudan, the average at the bottom, almost 50% of the food sources, of the calories consumed by households, are purchased from the market. Household production, the old subsistence system, amounts to much less than that, about 30%, and food aid 13%. You can also see that there's very, very wide regional variation, with some states purchasing nearly all their food and others very heavily, and only recently, very heavily dependent on food aid. Jonglei and Unity there are two examples of that. Warrap and Northern Bahr al-Ghazal are market-dependent states. So there's a lot of regional variation, and what you can't see on that figure is a lot of seasonal variation. Just before harvest is when markets are most important for people. I want you to think about this now. There's apparently a correlation between market dependence and hunger. The old system gave people quite a lot of calories. One of the very few nutritional studies conducted in the British period found that people living in the floodplains would eat 4,000 calories a day after the harvest, which is a huge amount, an American amount of calories to be eating. But now the new system doesn't seem to be meeting needs in the same way. So you can see here a graph, there it is, a graph showing a number of states where there are high levels of undernourished people. It's quite an old graph, this, 2009. There's more recent evidence which bears this out, but it states it in a slightly more confusing way. I haven't set it out here, but I've got a report published recently where you can look at all the evidence, and also you can look at the problems with these figures, which are very many. There are lots of problems with these figures. They're just sort of suggestive rather than things that you should rely on. But let's work with them anyway. You can see that there's a number of states where people are really very dependent on the market, and they're also pretty undernourished. And those states are the ones that are on the right of that graph. And I want you to look at this other study, which was conducted around the same time that the undernourishment and market dependent study was carried out. And this study asked people, how have you used cash? Has anybody in your house used cash in the last 7 days? And you can see that states like Warrap, Unity, Jonglei, they're in the middle and east of the country, very seldom use cash. Now, why am I drawing your attention to this? Well, these studies were undertaken in 2009. In 2012, 13, 14, these states produced maybe, I don't know, 200,000, 400,000 armed men for the wars. So the fact that people are switching to market dependence, the fact that market dependence may be tied to hunger, and the fact that it is tied up in the violence in a way that, I mean, I don't really understand, but there does seem to be a thing about people being cash-strapped, being desperate for food, and and then going towards survival strategies or income generation strategies, which are deeply, deeply counterproductive. And how much time have I got, Andrew?
Probably about 12, 15 minutes.
All right. Oh, that's loads of time. I'll try and finish it before. So now, you can't just so people are buying food from the market, and people need cash. And you don't just set up a market without changing a lot of things, other things in society. And one of those is that food production sort of becomes commodified too. Food becomes something that you buy and sell rather than something that you grow and keep. And this is a very interesting graph which I put together from FAO evidence, which shows that there's been a remarkable increase in production between 2000 and 2013. The harvested area, you can see, increased very dramatically, I think by more than doubled, according to FAO figures, which I must say, you've got to be very careful with these figures. They're estimates which are based on interviews with people in different states in about 30 different locations, and some satellite photography and that kind of thing. They're not very reliable, but I mean, if they're showing that there's been more than doubling of harvested area, one assumes there has been an increase of harvested area. Now, the World Bank estimates that it takes 16 to 20 days to clear a single hectare of land in South Sudan, to prepare it for cultivation. So if you've got sort of several 100,000 hectares that have been cleared, that's a huge amount of work. And certainly, if you ask a farmer if it takes 16 days, a farmer will say it takes about 16 days to plough a hectare, because people use hand tools on the whole to plough. So I think probably the World Bank may have been underestimating that. Huge amount of effort has gone into cultivation. And there's been an increase in the amount of food produced. However, South Sudan is dependent on some food aid, about 200,000 tons this year, I think. That's probably much less than a quarter of requirements. It would be about a third of, a quarter of local production, quarter of the value of local production, and much less than a quarter of requirements. But people are producing for markets. Here you see people in Ganliel, in the swampy southern corner of Unity State on the Nile, where people are selling fish, one of the oldest food commodities in South Sudan. Here you see somebody selling maize in Tarit, one of the green areas of the equatorial region, where commodification is taking place very quickly. Here's the son of a friend of mine with one of the many. Ugandans often do this grow. They give you what's the word? They put commands on to farmers on their advertising: grow more maize, or do more of this or that. So, and maize is a very interesting crop, which I found out as a result of this study. Maize is a crop which gives you more calories for less work for fewer hectares than sorghum, which is the majority crop, the most well-adapted, climate-appropriate, delicious, nutritious grain, which is the traditional grain in South Sudan. But maize is a sign that farmers are under pressure to produce more, very much. So, and that usually means commercial pressures to produce more. And you can see a dramatic increase in maize production, which is in the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa generally, is a sign that farmers need to produce more food. Now, you get this commodification of food, and then also you commodify labor. Now, as I said, going back to that graph there's been a huge amount of work invested in increasing agricultural production. And this is a graph, a bit difficult to understand, but it's difficult to do a graph which represents different variables across 79 counties. But each dot is a county. And the blue dots show counties where casual labor, casual agricultural or non-agricultural labor is a first livelihood activity. And the yellow ones show counties where it's the second livelihood activity reported by households, and the grey dots are combine those two. So you can see there's a huge, two things I think that graph tells me. First of all, in a lot of places, people are very, very much involved in wage labor, or more likely piecework. They're having to go out and earn money to fund their household's basic needs. The second thing that graph shows me is that there is a vast variation between different parts of South Sudan. You can see that in some places, nobody is involved in agricultural labor at all, and in other places, 60% of the population is involved in agriculture and other forms of casual labor. It's a really different, uneven spread of development, which it presents another set of challenges to would-be politicians or aid workers operating in the country. But a lot of people are now getting involved in casual labour. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And finally, I think I want to talk about commodification of land. And this is a really complicated topic. This is a map showing the cropland of South Sudan in a few years ago. I think it was generated in 2012 or 2011. And you can see that there's a lot of cropland in the south, and then an enormous amount of cropland in Warab and northern Bahr al-Ghazal, which are these places that I talked about where very high levels of market dependence, in Warab in particular, very low cash use, a lot of recruitment to militias, a lot of kind of chaotic, rapid transitions taking place. Commodification of land is interesting because it explains a bit about the new patterns of accumulation which are taking place in South Sudan at the moment. A slogan of the SPLA during its long arms struggle was "Land belongs to the people." And a garbled version of that slogan has found its way into the Constitution. It doesn't actually say that in the Constitution, but everybody believes that it says that in the Constitution, and that's as good as being in the Constitution if everybody believes that. And the people, the community, is defined in South Sudanese legislation in two ways. First of all, the community might be a lineage community that's unified by kinship and by language. It's an ethnic group, a tribe in the language of some people. And that's one possible definition of a community. And another possible definition, which is recognized by law in South Sudan, is a territorial community, people who are neighbors, who live together, whether or not they speak the same language, whether or not they're relatives or whatever. Now, because of this terrible rush towards ethnicized politics across the whole country, exemplified by the State Division Decree of 2015 and 2016, because the government doesn't have any shared economic interests with people and it resorts to ethnic chess playing instead of engaging in a policy way with society. For all those reasons, ethnicity is being increasingly defined in lineage kinship terms, in kind of reductive terms. So in order to accumulate some of that cropland and commercialize agriculture on it, you may well have to have an ethnic connection to it. So what you're seeing in some places, there are a number of ways in which cropland is being accumulated and put to commercial production. Some of it is land leases, some of it is prosperous smallholders outdoing their neighbors and starting to employ them as peace workers. But another way that's happening is big chiefs, big military men, are getting hold of cropland, using their power derived from the state and the apparatus of violence, but also using their lineage connections with a place to say that this belongs to a son of the area. And that's one of the issues which will be a very complicated one to resolve in the future, because if patterns of accumulation are structured around ethnic big men, like generalissimos whose claim to be allied to people is just the fact that they're born into the same community, that's going to be a very unsteady path towards market development. Now, I don't mean to sentimentalize the old system. I'm just going to conclude with this remark. The old system, few people in South Sudan are calling for a return to the happy days of subsistence, even though they were, the evidence available suggests that they were less hungry when they lived under that old system. Nearly everybody, or many people that I've spoken to, accept that these changes are going to unfold. But the way that they've been structured, the way that they've been organized, the way that they've been unfolding leads you to think that there are many, many problems ahead. So I'm sorry to end on a somewhat pessimistic note, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess I'll open the floor up for questions. I have my own, but let's open the floor. Just like to introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then take a round of questions. And
Sandy Wade. I used to work in the European Union in Addis Ababa.
All right.
The first time I went to South Sudan, I flew down to Yambio and then back up to Juba and spent 3 days looking. At the end of that time, I thought, what has South Sudan got? And the answer is not very much, but it's got land, water and people. And with land, water and people, you can make food, as you've been describing. It seems to me they have all the capability to make food for export and to sell much more widely. You haven't talked about that sort of that means of bringing money into the system, which is not related to oil and is related to something else. And my assumption is there are no exports at the moment from South Sudan. But do you have any feel for whether that's somewhere they could end up?
Sure. We take it. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ewan Grant, the former Customs and Excise Intelligence Analyst for the ex-Soviet states. I worked in East African community, and particularly my colleague Colin Gutsow has worked in development and border control in Minuli and Juba. My question really follows on partly from heavily from the previous question. Are there any signs that the FAO has got a grasp on the situation as South Sudan needs it? Are there any indicators that the structures are in force that would enable an export trade of agricultural products without selling off to dodgy external characters? In other words, we're hearing Saudi Arabia and other countries buying into the world. And finally, one short question. Is it the case, really, that the whole issues around the oil industry is more or less off limits? Nobody really knows what's going on, and who's getting paid and who isn't getting paid, and how that all operates. Thank you.
Thank you. Will I just answer those? Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting questions. And I decided not to put in the export tables because I thought you'd be tabled out by this point. But yes, is it possible to export food from South Sudan? Well, South Sudan has exported food for about. South Sudan didn't have international relations until very recently, and trade is part of, because it wasn't really a country, and it didn't, even when it was part of Sudan, it was it was cut off from the main areas of economic activity as a result of British policy, and then it became a kind of war zone for years and years. So it didn't really have much in the way of exports, but for 50 years or more, it's been exporting dried fish. It exported dried fish to the Belgian Congo, the former Belgian Congo, and to Zaire. And it exports it, I think, a bit to Sudan as well. But to the best of my knowledge, that's the only. And it did in certain periods. South Sudanese sorghum was exported to deal with famines elsewhere, or really big surges in supply. There was an attempt to do that in the 1940s, for example, where Juba was a station on the supply route to the Desert War in North Africa. So the possibility of export is there. But very little food is being exported, and in fact, South Sudan imports considerable amount of grain from Uganda and from Sudan. It imports maize from Uganda and sorghum from South Sudan. I have no idea what the figures are because I tried to do a study of figures using publicly available data, and it was so contradictory, the figures, that I just kind of gave up on them after a bit. It's difficult to work out the levels of those exports. Certainly Ugandan exports are relatively new, so Sudanese ones have been going on for quite a long time. That's the imports from Uganda and Sudan. But what are the obstacles towards export, to developing an export-oriented agricultural sector without sort of falling into this land-grabbing thing, which many people are cautious about? Well, first of all, most agriculture is done by hand tools in South Sudan. So productivity is not very high. Productivity is, under a ton per hectare. That's which is pretty low. I mean, sorghum productivity in the US, I think, is about 4 tons per hectare. So it's kind of pretty low by international standards and compared to a developed country. And then infrastructure really prevents farmers. Farmers do sell their food, but the food, I think, me and my colleagues think, circulates fairly narrowly in their area. It doesn't go far from very local markets and a lot of it is carried by bicycle. We're doing interviews with bike sellers next week. A lot of it is carried by bikes, pedal bikes or motorbikes to market. There aren't very good systems for acquiring harvests and then moving them. So that's one set of problems. Another issue is, and you asked about what the FAO is doing. I mean, across Africa is becoming more import dependent in food. It's not turning towards food export. It's becoming more import dependent. The sort of 10, 15-year trend has been, or even more than that actually, but pronounced in the last, in this century, is that Africa imports food rather than increasing production. And that's partly, I think, to do with the fact that there are so many things that are being sorted out at the moment. I mean, agricultural production, it's an interesting topic to be researching because almost nobody talks about it, because it's the last thing on the government's mind in many respects, where it's got to do peace deal with troublesome neighbours, all sorts of political stuff, and then this kind of rentier economy seizes its imagination, so it's not really able to focus on bread and butter issues. Another thing which I think is a caution for people hoping for an agricultural renaissance is Sudan has had that. Sudan has kind of commercialized huge areas. I mean, I heard the other day of a farm near Gadaref, which is the breadbasket of Sudan, which I was working with an agriculture professor, and he told me that he'd worked on a farm in Gadaref which was 100,000 either acres or hectares, 119,000 acres or hectares. And an acre is about 0.42 of a hectare, so I can't remember which one it was. A vast tract of land. But on Sudanese farms, you find that yields have not increased. And that is to do with a much more complicated issue. And that complicated issue is that labor prices are so low that it's cheaper to continue growing things like sorghum, using manual weeding, manual harvesting. And the wars of Sudan allow for a big supply of that dirt cheap labor. So the whole story of agriculture is tied up in that, in the war, and even more so because where it's happening in Sudan, that you have a huge commercial farm, that land may well have been taken from people who were farming, and maybe even with higher yields, which is the case in South Kordofan. You're using traditional methods, and now their lives have been turned on their head by this new system. So it goes to the heart of a lot of the politics of these countries, and it's a difficult thing to address. It requires very creative thinking. And I guess probably in the way that market development works, it may unfold of its own accord in unpredictable ways that like the whole thing about markets is you're not really supposed to be able to predict them that well, So it may happen in a way that, certainly will happen in a way that I haven't thought of. Then the oil industry, who knows what's happening? Definitely not me. That's all I don't know how the oil deals all work. But it seems that the kind of the entente between Sudan and South Sudan on oil revenues seems to be sort of more or less working. The government gets oil revenues. It's likely to be feeling quite optimistic about, expected price rises in crude oil. And do a lot of calculations about that. Some people, the government has come up with this, often comes up with inscrutable policies. The latest one is to invest $500 million in roads with funding from a Cairo-based export-import bank and handing over a huge amount of the money. Taking on credit. Taking on debts from East Asian investors and East Asian state investors and using that to buy roads. Well, some people think that the reason for that, and I have no way of knowing if this is true, I'm just retailing you some gossip here, is that because the peace deal requires the return of the opposition, the government may want to offshore, use debt as a mechanism of offshoring all of its income over the next few years, and keeping all fiscal questions out of political discourse for the foreseeable future, thus depriving the opposition of any power. I don't know if that's true or that's some clever line that somebody's dreamt up, but anyway.
You might want to have a word with the ICIJ on that. Just this week, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they've just launched a program this week on Mauritius as a haven. Certainly we do know, of course, that Mauritius has been used by the Ugandans and others, and displacement in European Union directives, meaning there's happening quite a lot more of that.
Right.
Mauritius is offshore in more ways than one.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Tim,
yeah.
Tim Morris, I was British ambassador in Juba from 15 to 17. Can I just make just a couple of quick comments related to what you said, and then a particular question. It's really interesting, Eddie. I felt in a way that in all the sort of discussions about politics and security and all the dramas that South Sudan is going through, we didn't really get under the surface of the structure of agriculture. The symptoms were all absolutely there, from starvation through to through disruption of production. The latter most strikingly in 2016, when the violence shifted to equatorial, and so it disrupted two harvests in rapid succession, lost the whole production there, which hadn't been the case in 2013.
Yeah, absolutely.
From talking to people and living there, without a doubt, there was a belief that, done right, South Sudan could be the sort of breadbasket for the whole region. The physical aspects of the country, extraordinary fertility of the country, mean that theoretically at least that could be done. As you suggested, I thought it was very variable. There were some leaders and indeed some generals who would trumpet their sort of agricultural background and their ownership of farms, but it was very mixed. And there was only one brief moment after the turn of Riek, when there was a sort of government set up, and the minister then sort of started actually doing some planning. And I think one meeting I had in 2 years, which was actually about something. rather than just about
No more alcohol?
yeah.
Yeah.
It was lounge, which was amazing.
yes.
Because, you know, our conversations were always about the usual things. And then suddenly he was talking about seeds and
He sees, yeah.
falling in the ground. It was very sad, and then of course he went and just a moment which passed. My question is about, you know, the age-old thing, which is not exclusive to South Sudan, of course, about the pastoralists and the cattle as opposed to the farmers, because obviously the country is fundamentally split between those two traditions, and it's a very destructive split. Could you just say something about that? I mean, how, without, I mean, I suppose you could track,
Yeah.
you could draw the whole picture of all the states and
Yeah.
the South Sudan and work out percentages of populations of herders and populations
Right.
of agriculturists. And, you know, the general preponderance towards the south, the equatorials of,
Yeah.
of agriculture. But how does that work? Has that always been a destructive factor in the same way? Or
Yeah.
possibly even, I think what I'm getting at is really, it's something more fundamental, is whether this has been a driver of violence, and a driver of political disruption,
Yeah.
or whether it's a sad accidental
Right.
consequence.
Well, that's a very interesting set of reflections. Thank you very much, and also an interesting question. And certainly this piece of work that I've been involved in, it's a sort of 5-year research project, and we're in year 2, has been a revealing one for me, and because and it's revealing with regard to your question, because one of the things that the FAO routinely reports is that the highest cereal producing state in South Sudan is actually Warab and not Equatoria. You can find the data in an annual report called the Crop and Food Security Assessment Mission, which is published by FAO and WFP jointly, and you have to Google quite cleverly to get it, but you can get it if you're determined. So, and another really revealing thing about this piece of work that I've been doing, Tim, is that I'm working with a great young team of faculty from the Catholic University in Juba, and some of whom are from pastoralist backgrounds, from pastoralist social groups, and others are from agrarian ones. One is from Abyei and another is from Rumbek. Those are Dinka areas, which is very much seen as cattle country, pastoralist country. And one of the things that I found out listening to them, the importance of sorghum to daily life, sorghum as part of ritual. They both had, they were both doing interviews about changing tastes in grain, and they both had relatives who had, when they'd been displaced in the 90s, had gone back secretly to their original homeland just to take the seeds of the sorghum, their preferred variety of long maturing, high protein, flavoursome sorghum. So, and sorghum and milk are really key components of the diet of the pastoralist peoples. The tensions that are made a lot of recently are to do with a number of wide-ranging social changes. First of all, a lot of the wars were fought in if I could just stand up for a minute, the floodplain zone, which is this deep, muddy clay place, which I'm sure you know very well, is kind of around here, all right? And that's the river running through the middle. And this area is very suited to cattle production, but you have to grow crops on what is called highland being maybe 1 meter or 2 meters high, but high enough not to be swamped when the floods rise during the rainy season. These areas here are mixed ecologies, quite a number of different ecologies, but until very recently they were quite grassy, and grassy meant a lot of tsetse fly. So there was a kind of natural boundary for the herds, because they didn't stray into the tsetse territory. Now that boundary is being eroded by a number of factors. One of them is better veterinarian drugs. Another is increased population pressures is reducing the height of the grass. You know, more land under cultivation reduces the height of the grass, and so and so that sort of natural boundary for the pastoralist zone is being eroded. At the same time, that floodplain area was the centre of intense, unimaginable violence during the 1990s and 1980s, and that pushed, and subsequently as well, up till now, and that has pushed many people with their herds towards these areas that were predominantly agrarian and, importantly, culturally agrarian. There is a cultural difference in a way. People also kept livestock, but they didn't have these big herds, and they didn't have this transhumance, this practice of moving with your herd to watering holes, to water places and pastures. And that has caused a number of problems, and those problems have been aggravated in turn by the fact that the pastoralists who are moving into these agrarian areas come from an area where there's been a lot of war, where a lot of people are soldiers, where a lot of commanders come from. So they're seen as connected to the security system. They're seen as connected to the state. They're seen as people who can be backed by a local general or colonel who back up their claims if they come into a fight with the agrarians. And that has led to a lot of like bitter unhappiness with the arrival of these. They're seen as people forcing their way in, colonizing, rather than people following the very, very sort of common, traditional patterns of migration which most people in South Sudan welcome, you know, pretty unreservedly. So I think those are all factors that are complicating relationship between those two groups. Another thing is that one should be cautious of drawing too stark a division between the pastoralists and agriculture. All pastoralists are agro-pastoralists. They're actually agro-pisco-pastoralists, as one pernickety anthropologist likes to say, and that's the same of all agrarians. They're agraro, whatever, pasto agrarians or something. They all have some chickens and goats kind of thing. But it's more that what's distinctive about the floodplains is this transhuman pastoralism, this moving all of the young people, and at the end of the sort of withered end of the dry season, all of the population practically moves to pastures and water areas, and so it's kind of quite a different culture from elsewhere.
I had a question.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
In relation to what you described, following up from what Tim has mentioned, is there a likelihood that where you see these areas, so Torridge, for example, which is traditionally seen as a place where it used to feed many people in South Sudan, and you obviously talked about Warab, whether these areas are more likely to experience intense conflicts going forward, particularly because of the nature of agriculture in these areas, probably separate from other places like Malakal, but also whether or not Sudan and Uganda would play a role in maybe buying up parts of these lands as well. Is that something you can see, envision happening?
That's a really good point. You're mentioning Torridge. Just again show people on the map. That's Torridge there, and that's actually, it doesn't look like a very green place. It's an incredibly green place because it has mountains, and it's also a very fertile place. And it's also a place which has an infrastructural connection with the capital. So it is a place, that picture I showed you, Grow More Maize, is from the road south of Torridge. And people are growing commercial maize and selling it in Juba. And the picture I showed you of the warehouse full of sacks of maize, that one there, that's in Torridge. And that's maize from that road that is being brought up there. And that road was built by a World Bank, I think Chinese project, the World Bank China project, and which has been relatively successful, I suppose, in promoting this kind of small-scale agricultural production, motorbike, and maybe some lorry deliveries to Juba of maize, which is produced by hand. So it may be that these places are a kind of lead area for trialling commercial production. It's hard to get tractors to tractors just kind of they just don't seem to get off the ground in many. I have seen some places where they're working, but they don't seem to be able to get very far outside of cities. Maintenance is very, very difficult. There was a lot of war on that road in the last few years, so the idea that you could just kind of have the diesel pumping in and the tractor parts coming in, it sounds ridiculous, but it's almost impossible sometimes to do. With regarding land grabs, there have been some, or however you want to characterize it, that's a very kind of moralistic way of putting it, but I mean, will there be large-scale land acquisitions in Sudan and South Sudan in the future? There's an interesting report written by David Deng in 2011 and published by the Norwegian People's Aid, I think, on land grabs, or whatever you call it, land acquisitions in South Sudan. There certainly has been some interest, but my experience or my little understanding of them is that, even if investors would undertake a kind of shaky contract with a local traditional leader who had legal authority over the land, but even if they could do that, the infrastructural basis for commercial agriculture wasn't there, so it'd be hard for them to grow a lot of stuff. There are some commercial farms, mainly in the south of central Equatoria, just about where it says central Equatoria there, where tobacco has been grown for many years for commercial consumption. But it seems that the people that were taking out these leases were often they appeared to be somewhat dubious entities that were, I sometimes thought maybe they're just doing it to have, they're paying a bit of a down payment now and then they'll have a basis for litigation in the future rather than a basis for production in the future. It seemed so impossible that they could. This is an extremely small. I have a friend from here, Longachok, which is I once went there about 10 or 12 years ago. Went on a helicopter. It was like to try and find somebody. But anyway, I mean, it was so far from anywhere. People had that thyroid problem that comes from a lack of iodine, and that's a sign of remoteness, really, that you can't even get iodized salt to the place, which you can get to most places in the world today, and which UNICEF provides kind of whenever people need it. It was extremely remote. Somebody had taken out a massive lease on there. Now, how on earth they could get the agricultural inputs there and the production out, I don't know. So I think it's something. I think maybe what is useful to watch is patterns of accumulation of land. So there's some leaseholding going on. There's some commercial small-scale farming which is kind of spreading a bit, and there's some of this kind of military acquisition of land. Which of those is going to be most important? Which of those is going to be the most effective way of producing and is going to be able to dominate markets? I think that's a big question. Not much evidence to take a view. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Just one
Yeah,
thought,
yeah.
if I may add.
Yeah.
Come back to the security picture exclusively.
Yeah.
And then up to date, the history since 2017 hasn't been that encouraging.
Yeah.
I mean, the security breakdown of the country is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Developments, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned
Yeah.
tourism. I think for all the time I was there, the road was blocked,
Was it really?
and everything was being stolen
Yeah.
to go on the road.
Yeah.
And the country's in civil war.
Yeah.
Just broke it down. The first thing that was affected was obviously the people of South Sudan, as you mentioned, and their agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
It was the president's advisor who said to me regretfully about the meltdown in 2016 and how all the trouble and people fleeing the land across into Uganda that meant the destruction of the harvests, all created by human beings.
Yeah. And
It's not to preach about it, but it's I I left South Sudan still optimistic in a way because I love the place so much.
Yeah, it's a great place.
And we all do, you know, those of us who've lived there. And if only that would stop, you can't help feeling that there's so many clever people
Absolutely,
there who would get a grip on agriculture, because the actual return on investment which could be made by small scale agriculture would be quite phenomenal. But it does need the roads being open and for all the blocks to be, you know, all the steaming going on all the roads to be moved, which of course is a huge
And I think that's a problem about having a huge section of the population moving into military activities, then finding it's not getting paid, but having a very urgent need for cash. Like, it's not that if you're not getting paid, it's not that you can go, oh, I'll just go off and farm then. Do you know what I mean? You do need to eat until the next harvest, sort of thing. And that is also driving this roadblock insecurity, all of these local, terrible local clashes that are really undermining everybody's life and making people hungrier and, you know, more. So yes, it's a difficult situation, but I completely agree with you. I've given a somewhat pessimistic picture, but one does feel more optimistic just being there, as I was the last few weeks, because there is an incredible energy about South Sudan, an incredible sense of possibility, and even though the situation is bleak in many respects, there is a way forward. Maybe not one that outsiders like me can understand, but there is a way forward.
Sorry,
Good.
just a quick follow-up.
Yes, certainly.
A company I was working for was involved in the ordnance management and the clearance of landmines.
All right.
Is that affecting agriculture in different areas? Is it mostly done now, or is there still a significant restriction on the land that can be used?
I'm not sure if I could answer that question very precisely. I mean, I know there was a big push on that.
Yeah,
I mean,
project.
They
stopped in
17.
But I mean, there certainly was a significant improvement in the years of peace, which roughly ran from 2002 really until, you know, because peace kind of, in a lot of areas, it was relatively calm before the peace agreement in 2005, and then it ran up to 2012, 2013. So there was a lot of effort put into that. There still are problems happening, and I know that it's not resolved everywhere. Just to give you an example, in this place that we've just been talking about, Tariq Magui, this place where there's this road and that lets people export to Juba, and where exports are actually taking place. I was there a few years ago, and it was my first time to phone up the UN landmine hotline, because the compound of the Catholic Church there had a stash of munitions. That area was a centre of the Lord's Resistant Army. It had been traded between different terrifying armed groups for years and years. Its whole population had been kind of expelled until about 2005, and then people had reconstituted themselves and started farming again. But it seemed that some of the mine clearance was being done by talented locals, kind of thing. And they had these piles, and I was sitting having my cup of tea, and what's that? Oh, it's munitions, sort of thing, you know. So I phoned them up, and they did go and clear them pretty quickly, I must say. They turned up and got rid of this stash. So. Yeah, I don't know though. I don't have figures, but I'm sure you could find it from an organisation called UNMAS, which you may already be in contact with. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that brings us to the end of this discussion. Can we just thank Eddie for giving this brilliant discussion as well, and for your insightful questions as well.